I was stuck overnight with him. Then everything changed. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Before we jump into today's story, we have one small favor to ask. If you enjoy emotional gay love stories filled with romance, unexpected twists, and unforgettable moments, please take a second to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It's completely free, and every subscription helps us continue bringing you more heartfelt stories you'll love. We'd also love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city or country in the comments below and say hello. We enjoy hearing from viewers all around the world. Thank you so much for your support. Now let's get started with today's story. The strangest part about that night was never the storm. It was the quiet sentence that made me realize someone had remembered me for years while I had completely forgotten him. Those words did not make sense when I first heard them. At the time, I was standing inside a dark mountain cabin while rain struck the windows hard enough to sound like handfuls of pebbles. The fireplace crackled softly behind me, casting warm light across the wooden floor as a man I had only met hours earlier looked out into the storm and said, almost to himself, "I remembered you long before you remembered me." Before I could ask what he meant, my mind carried me back to that morning. I had left Portland before sunrise with a travel mug full of black coffee and the kind of detailed schedule that made my coworkers laugh. As a landscape designer, I believed every successful project started with careful planning. You measured everything, prepared for every possibility, and never left important decisions to chance. That philosophy worked well for my career. It had not worked nearly as well for my personal life. 2 years earlier, I had watched a relationship slowly disappear beneath broken promises and mismatched expectations. Since then, I had poured my energy into work because blueprints never changed their minds, and trees never stopped trusting you halfway through a project. My destination was a forest retreat in Oregon where I had been hired to evaluate walking trails and outdoor gathering spaces for an upcoming renovation. The drive through the mountains was peaceful at first. Tall evergreen trees lined the highway while low clouds drifted lazily across distant hills. The weather forecast predicted heavy rain by evening, but I expected to finish my inspection long before conditions became serious. About 20 miles from the retreat, I stopped at a small roadside general store to buy another coffee and something quick for lunch. The store was quiet except for an old country song playing softly through ceiling speakers and the steady sound of rain beginning to tap against the windows. I walked toward the coffee station just as another customer reached for the final insulated cup beside the machine. Our hands paused at exactly the same moment. "Looks like we picked the same timing," the stranger said with an easy smile. He was tall, athletic, and wore a Navy Ranger jacket with a Forest Service patch on one shoulder. Short dark brown hair framed calm gray-blue eyes that somehow looked familiar even though I was certain we had never met. "Go ahead," I replied, stepping back. "You got here first." Instead of taking the cup, he slid it toward me. "You look like you need it more." I laughed quietly. "Do I look that tired?" "Not tired," he answered. "Just focused." Then, before I had introduced myself or mentioned my work, he reached for a packet of hazelnut creamer and placed it beside the cup. "You usually take one of these." I stared at him. "Excuse me." He blinked once, almost catching himself. Lucky guess. Something about the exchange felt strange, but before I could question him further, the cashier called out that a severe weather advisory had just been issued for the mountain roads. Several customers immediately glanced toward the windows where the rain had become noticeably heavier. I paid for my coffee and sandwich, nodded politely to the stranger, and headed outside. As I unlocked my truck, I looked back through the store window. He was still standing there, coffee untouched, watching me leave with an expression that was impossible to read. I dismissed the moment as coincidence, climbed into my truck, and continued toward the retreat, never imagining that within a few hours every road home would disappear beneath the storm, and the man from that quiet little store would become the one person capable of changing everything I believed about chance, memory, and the unexpected ways two lives can cross paths. The rain grew heavier with every mile, turning the narrow mountain road into a ribbon of gray stretching through endless evergreens. By the time I reached the entrance to the forest retreat, windshield wipers were working at full speed just to keep the road visible. An older woman working in the reception office greeted me with a welcoming smile, though she glanced toward the dark sky more often than toward the paperwork on her desk. You might want to finish your inspection before sunset, she said while handing me the key to cabin 7. The weather changes quickly around here. I thanked her, loaded my backpack over one shoulder, and drove the final half-mile to the cabin. It sat alone beside a quiet lake, surrounded by towering pine trees that swayed gently beneath the growing wind. Even under heavy clouds, the place was beautiful. A wooden deck overlooked the water, stone pathways curved through wildflower gardens now resting beneath the rain, and the cabin itself looked as though it belonged inside a travel magazine. I unlocked the front door and immediately noticed the comforting scent of cedar mixed with fresh paint. Sunlight still filtered faintly through the large windows facing the lake, giving the spacious living room a warm glow despite the weather outside. I unpacked my measuring tools, camera, notebook, and site plans before beginning my inspection. For nearly 2 hours, I walked every trail, measured retaining walls, photographed planting areas, and sketched notes about future improvements. My work absorbed me so completely that I barely noticed how dark the afternoon had become until thunder rolled across the mountains. When I stepped back inside the cabin, rain hammered against the roof with enough force to drown out almost every other sound. The lights flickered once, then twice, before suddenly going dark. The heater fell silent. Even the digital clock above the fireplace disappeared into blackness. I reached for my phone out of habit. No signal. I moved toward the window hoping to catch even a single bar of service, but the forest outside had vanished behind sheets of rain. Before I could decide what to do next, someone knocked firmly on the front door. The sound echoed through the quiet cabin. I opened it carefully and found the same man from the general store standing beneath the porch roof, rain dripping from his Navy Ranger jacket. "Looks like we keep running into each other," he said with the same calm smile. "You work here?" I asked, still surprised. He nodded. "Mason Reed, Forest Ranger." He extended his hand. I was checking cabins before the storm became worse. I finally shook his hand. "Logan Hayes." His expression softened ever so slightly, as though hearing my name confirmed something already sitting in his mind. Before either of us spoke again, a loud cracking sound echoed somewhere beyond the trees. We both turned toward the road just in time to see several large branches collapse across the only exit leading back toward the highway. Rain blurred the view almost immediately afterward, but the blocked road was impossible to miss. Mason watched quietly for a few seconds before letting out a slow breath. "Well," he said, looking back at me with remarkable composure, "it appears neither of us is going anywhere tonight." I glanced once more toward my useless phone, then back toward the storm outside. For the first time all day, my perfectly organized schedule no longer mattered. The mountain had already made a different plan. For a few moments, neither of us moved. Rain pounded against the cabin roof while distant thunder rolled through the valley, making the windows tremble just enough to remind me how isolated we really were. Mason quietly closed the front door before another gust of wind pushed cold air inside. He removed his soaked ranger hat, hung his jacket near the entrance, and looked around the cabin with the calm attention of someone who had done this countless times before. "The fireplace still works," he said after a quick glance around the living room. "That will make tonight a lot easier." I folded my arms. "You sound surprisingly relaxed for someone who just watched the only road disappear." He smiled. "The road will still be there tomorrow. Worrying tonight will not clear it any faster." I wanted to disagree, but part of me admired how naturally he accepted situations beyond his control. Mason opened a weatherproof backpack and placed a flashlight, a portable weather radio, a first aid kit, and a thermos on the kitchen counter. "Occupational habit," he explained after catching me watching. "I never drive into the mountains without emergency supplies." I laughed softly. I packed measuring tape, trail maps, and colored landscape markers. He nodded thoughtfully. "Different jobs, different priorities." We spent the next half hour checking the cabin together. Mason inspected every window, secured the back door, tested the fireplace damper, and made sure the rain was not leaking through the roof. I followed behind with a flashlight, handing him whatever he needed. He never barked orders or acted as though I was in the way. Instead, he explained everything in a patient voice that somehow made unfamiliar tasks feel simple. "Pull that curtain closed after sunset," he said. "It helps keep the room warmer." A few minutes later, he added, "There is extra firewood on the covered porch. We should bring some inside before the rain gets worse." Outside, the storm had become even heavier. Thick curtains of rain blurred the forest until the trees looked like shadows painted across gray glass. When we finished carrying in enough firewood for the evening, Mason switched on the weather radio. A comm announcer confirmed that multiple roads across the mountain had been temporarily closed because of fallen trees and flooding. Estimated reopening time would depend entirely on the weather. Mason quietly switched the radio off. Looks like we have plenty of time to get to know each other. I smiled despite myself. I suppose pretending you are not here would make for a very long night. He laughed. Exactly. We searched the kitchen cabinets together and found enough supplies for a simple dinner. There were cans of soup, pasta, crackers, oatmeal, peanut butter, coffee, and a surprising number of hot chocolate packets. Mason held one up with a completely serious expression. This might be the most important survival item in the cabin. I shook my head. Hot chocolate. Never underestimate good morale. I laughed louder than I expected. You have definitely given this speech before. Only to people who looked like they needed convincing. While water heated on the stove, I watched him move comfortably through the unfamiliar kitchen, preparing dinner without hesitation. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. He simply seemed happiest whenever he was helping someone else. It was strangely reassuring. I still could not explain why he had guessed my favorite coffee creamer that morning or why he kept looking at me with quiet familiarity. But instead of making me uncomfortable, the mystery had begun to spark curiosity. Somewhere between carrying firewood through the rain and laughing over emergency hot chocolate, the distance between two strangers had already become smaller than either of us expected. The smell of warm soup slowly filled the cabin while rain continued drumming against the roof with steady determination. Outside, darkness settled over the forest much earlier than usual, covering the lake and surrounding trees until they disappeared behind sheets of rain. Inside, however, the fireplace spread a comforting glow across the wooden walls, making the cabin feel smaller in the best possible way. Mason placed 2 bowls on the dining table and stepped back with an amused smile. I cannot promise this is award-winning cooking, he said, but it has never failed to improve a bad weather forecast. I picked up a spoon and tasted the soup before nodding with exaggerated seriousness. I have had much worse in restaurants. He laughed. I will take that as a compliment. Dinner turned out to be surprisingly easy. Of my head. Please tell me nobody saw that, Mason said while trying not to laugh. Unfortunately, 3 co-workers witnessed the entire performance. He shook his head with a grin. That actually makes me feel better about humanity. Our conversation drifted naturally from one topic to another until it felt less like speaking with a stranger and more like catching up with someone I had not seen in years. After dinner, we cleaned the kitchen together without discussing whose responsibility it was. I washed the dishes while Mason dried them, occasionally pretending to inspect each plate with exaggerated professionalism before placing it into the cabinet. Excellent craftsmanship, he declared after examining a perfectly ordinary bowl. 5 stars. You have very high standards, I replied. Only for bowls. Once everything was clean, Mason noticed a shelf filled with board games beside the fireplace. He pulled out an old strategy game with faded corners and raised one eyebrow. Competitive? Reasonably. That sounds like someone who absolutely hates losing. I simply appreciate winning. We settled onto the living room rug with mugs of hot chocolate beside us and began playing beneath the warm glow of the fire. Every few minutes, one of us discovered another forgotten rule hidden inside the instruction booklet, leading to playful arguments about whose interpretation was correct. You completely invented that rule, I accused after Mason made another unexpected move. He looked genuinely offended. I prefer the term creative interpretation. That is somehow even less convincing. We both laughed until the sound echoed through the quiet cabin. The storm outside no longer felt threatening. It had become little more than distant background noise beneath easy conversation and shared laughter. Later, after we packed the game away, I wandered toward the large window overlooking the lake. Rain blurred the view so completely that the forest beyond looked like a watercolor painting. Mason joined me, standing just far enough away to respect my space. Still thinking about tomorrow? He asked. A little, I admitted. Mostly wondering how quickly everything changed today. He nodded thoughtfully. Life does that sometimes. The days we plan the least often leave the strongest memories. I glanced toward him, noticing that same familiar expression I had seen several times already. It was not simply kindness. It was recognition. The feeling returned almost immediately. Somehow Mason seemed to know me in ways that made no logical sense. Before I could ask the question forming in my mind, a sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin windows, and something on the bookshelf behind us slipped free, landing softly on the wooden floor. When I bent down to pick it up, I realized I was holding an old framed photograph that would quietly begin answering questions I had not even known how to ask. The old photograph felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. Its wooden frame was worn smooth from years of use, and a thin layer of dust suggested it had not been touched in a long time. I brushed the glass gently with my sleeve and looked closer. A group of volunteers stood together beneath a park entrance sign, smiling despite muddy boots and tired faces. Young trees lined the background while shovels and gardening tools rested against a pickup truck. It looked like one of those community restoration projects people joined for a weekend before returning to their ordinary lives. Then my eyes stopped on a familiar face. Mason stood near the back of the group wearing the same easy smile I had seen all evening. He looked a little younger, but there was no mistaking him. "You were part of this?" I asked quietly without taking my eyes off the picture. Mason walked over and immediately recognized the photograph. For the first time since we had met, he hesitated before answering. "Yes," he said softly. "That was several years ago." I studied the other faces until something unexpected caught my attention. Near the front of the photograph stood another volunteer with messy hair, rolled-up sleeves, and a bright green volunteer shirt covered in dirt. It took me several seconds to realize I was looking at myself. My heart skipped. "Wait," I whispered. "That is me." Mason nodded once. "It is." I looked back and forth between the picture and him, trying to understand why. I remembered the event, but not the person standing only a few feet behind me. Fragments of that day slowly surfaced. A state park recovering after a wildfire. Hundreds of volunteers planting native trees. Long hours carrying soil, repairing trails, and rebuilding picnic areas. I remembered laughing with strangers, sharing sandwiches during lunch, and driving home exhausted but proud. Yet Mason was missing from every memory. "I do not understand," I admitted. "How could I forget you?" Mason leaned lightly against the bookshelf, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Because we barely spoke." I looked at him, confused. He continued, "Toward the end of the day, you were exhausted. You had been working for hours without taking many breaks. I noticed you looked dizzy, so I brought you a bottle of water and helped you carry a few supplies back to the equipment tent. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. I closed my eyes, searching deeper into memories that had almost disappeared with time. A cool bottle pressed into my hand. Someone reminding me to sit down before standing again. A voice telling me the trail work could wait until I felt better. The details remained blurry, but the feeling of quiet kindness suddenly returned with surprising clarity. I opened my eyes again. "That was you." Mason smiled gently. "Yes." I lowered the photograph and looked at him in complete disbelief. "You recognized me at the general store." He gave another small nod. "The moment you reached for the coffee. Then why did you pretend it was a lucky guess?" He looked toward the fire before answering. "Because I was not sure whether reminding you of someone you barely remembered would make you comfortable or simply awkward. I thought it was better to let the day unfold naturally." His answer settled over the room with the warmth of the fire itself. There was nothing dramatic about it. No grand confession. Just quiet honesty. Suddenly, every strange detail from the day made sense. The familiar look in his eyes, the hazelnut creamer, the calm smile that had always seemed to carry an unspoken memory. While I had believed we were meeting for the first time, Mason had been patiently waiting to see if the past would find its way back to me all on its own. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain continued tapping gently against the cabin windows, but it no longer sounded restless. It almost felt as though the storm itself had grown quieter after the truth finally found its way into the room. I carefully placed the old photograph back onto the bookshelf and sat down beside the fireplace, still trying to connect the distant memory from years ago with the man sitting only a few feet away. Mason poured 2 fresh mugs of coffee without saying anything. He handed one to me with the same quiet kindness I now realized had never been accidental. I accepted it and smiled faintly. "You remembered all this time?" I asked. He nodded once. "Not every little detail. Just enough." I looked down at the steam rising from my mug. "I cannot believe I forgot someone who helped me." Mason leaned back in his chair, and gave a small shrug. You did not owe me a memory. That day was important to me because I noticed you. For you, it was one afternoon during a volunteer event with dozens of people. Life moved on. I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. Some moments stayed with one person while quietly disappearing from another. I almost introduced myself back then, Mason admitted after another moment of silence. After everyone finished cleaning up, I thought about asking if you wanted to get coffee someday. I looked up in surprise. What happened? He laughed softly at himself. I lost my nerve. By the time I convinced myself to walk over, you had already climbed into your truck and driven away. I smiled despite myself. That does sound unfortunate. It felt that way for a while. He looked toward the fire before continuing. Eventually, I figured life was simply telling me it was not the right time. I stared into the flames, thinking about how many ordinary decisions quietly shaped the future without anyone realizing it. If I had packed my tools a few minutes later that day years ago, maybe we would have talked. If I had skipped the general store that morning, maybe we never would have met again. The thought was strangely comforting rather than frustrating. You? No, I said. I spent the last 2 years believing everything important had to be carefully planned. Mason smiled. And now? I laughed quietly. Now I am sitting in a mountain cabin drinking coffee with someone I was apparently supposed to remember years ago. Life has a funny sense of timing. Before I could answer, a soft warning beep echoed from somewhere near the kitchen. Mason immediately turned his attention toward the sound. He stood, walked into the utility room, and examined the small control panel mounted beside the backup heating system. A yellow indicator light blinked steadily. Nothing serious, he said after a quick look, but the pressure is dropping. We should fix it before it becomes a problem overnight. I followed him into the narrow utility room filled with neatly labeled pipes and valves. Tell me what to do, I said without hesitation. Mason looked at me with a slightly surprised smile. Really? I nodded. You trusted me enough to wait for me to remember. I think I can trust you enough to hold a flashlight. He laughed warmly and handed me the light. That sounds like a fair trade. As I illuminated the pressure gauge while he adjusted a valve, I realized something had changed inside me without my noticing. Earlier that day, I had instinctively tried to handle every challenge alone. Now standing shoulder to shoulder with Mason in the warm glow of the utility room, helping solve a small problem together felt more natural than facing it by myself. Somewhere between an old photograph and an unfinished conversation from years ago, trust had quietly replaced the need to always be in control. The small pressure gauge slowly climbed back into the safe range before settling into a steady green light. Mason tightened the last valve, stepped back, and listened to the quiet hum of the heating system returning to its normal rhythm. Warm air drifted through the vents a few seconds later, filling the utility room with comforting heat. There we go, he said with quiet satisfaction. That should keep the cabin comfortable until morning. I lowered the flashlight and smiled. I officially assisted in my first heating system repair. Mason laughed. You were an excellent flashlight operator. That sounds suspiciously like a compliment with very low expectations. Not at all. Good teamwork depends on people doing different jobs well. We walked back into the living room, carrying our coffee mugs. Outside, the rain had finally begun to weaken, although occasional gusts of wind still swept through the trees surrounding the lake. The fire continued burning steadily, throwing gentle shadows across the wooden walls. I settled into the chair closest to the fireplace, while Mason sat across from me, stretching his legs toward the warmth. The cabin had become remarkably quiet, almost peaceful after everything that had happened during the evening. Can I ask you something? I said after several minutes. Mason nodded. Anything. I looked into the fire before speaking. Why did you never try to find me after that volunteer project? He considered the question carefully instead of answering immediately. I thought about it, he admitted. More than once. My eyes met his. Then why did you stop? He smiled with quiet honesty. Because I only knew your first name. There were probably hundreds of people named Logan across Oregon. Even if I had found you somehow, I was never sure whether interrupting your life because of a brief conversation would have been fair. I let those words settle for a moment. There was something deeply respectful about the answer. He had remembered me, but he had never tried to force himself into my story. I spent a long time believing I needed to control every outcome, I confessed. Every project, every decision, every relationship. I convinced myself that if I planned well enough, Nothing unexpected could ever hurt me again. Mason leaned forward slightly, resting his hands around his mug. Did it work? I smiled faintly. No, it only made my world smaller. He nodded with understanding rather than sympathy. Sometimes the safest place becomes the loneliest one. His words landed with surprising accuracy. I realized that my carefully organized routines had protected me from disappointment, but they had also kept genuine connection at a distance. Before I could respond, another strong gust of wind rattled the cabin. A window near the back hallway shifted slightly, allowing a thin stream of rainwater to drip onto the wooden floor. I stood automatically. That cannot be good. Mason was already walking toward it, but instead of telling me to move aside, he looked at me with complete confidence. I will hold the window steady. Can you grab the extra weather seal from the utility shelf? Without hesitation, I hurried to the storage room, found the seal exactly where he had described, and returned. We worked together without confusion or panic. Mason kept the frame aligned while I carefully pressed the weather strip into place and secured the loose latch. The draft disappeared almost immediately. We both stepped back to inspect our work. Looks solid, Mason said with an approving smile. I laughed quietly. I guess I am improving. You are, he replied. Not because you fixed a window. Because this time you did not try to handle everything by yourself. I looked at the secure window, then back at him, realizing he was right. Earlier that morning, I would have insisted on solving every problem alone. Now I understood that trusting someone was not a sign of weakness. Sometimes it was simply another way of finding strength, and standing beside Mason in the warm cabin while the last of the storm faded into the night, I found myself hoping morning would not arrive quite as quickly as the clock insisted it would. Morning arrived almost unnoticed. I woke to soft golden light slipping through the cabin windows instead of the relentless sound of rain that had filled the night before. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a silence so complete that it almost felt unfamiliar. I stepped onto the porch carrying a warm mug of coffee and paused to take in the view. The lake reflected a clear blue sky, mist drifted gently above the water, and sunlight shimmered across pine trees still covered with tiny drops of rain. It was difficult to believe this peaceful landscape had been surrounded by chaos only hours earlier. Mason was already outside, leaning against the porch railing with his own coffee. He looked over and smiled. Good morning. Good morning, I replied. It feels like an entirely different place. He nodded. The mountains are good at reminding people that difficult weather never lasts forever. We stood together without speaking for several moments, watching sunlight slowly reach the far side of the lake. The quiet no longer felt awkward. It felt comfortable, like something neither of us needed to explain. Eventually Mason checked his radio. A clear voice reported that road crews had removed the fallen branches overnight, and the main access road would reopen within the hour. Looks like you will be able to finish your trip after all, he said. I looked toward the driveway instead of answering immediately. The news should have made me happy. My schedule would finally return to normal. My project could continue exactly as planned. Yet the only feeling I noticed was an unexpected reluctance to leave. We packed the cabin together, folding blankets, washing the last coffee mugs, and returning the old photograph carefully to its place on the bookshelf. Before closing the front door, I glanced around one last time. The fireplace, the board game, the weathered wooden walls, and the quiet living room had somehow become part of a memory I knew would stay with me for a very long time. Outside, our vehicles waited beneath bright morning sunlight. We loaded our bags in comfortable silence until everything was ready. Mason reached into the pocket of his ranger jacket and pulled out a simple business card from the Forest Service. Turning it over, he wrote something on the blank back before handing it to me. His phone number appeared beneath one short sentence written in neat handwriting. I read the words twice. I already missed one chance to know you. I do not want to miss another. I slowly looked up at him. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation, only quiet sincerity. I carefully placed the card inside my wallet instead of slipping it into my pocket with the rest of my papers. I think that is a very reasonable request, I said with a smile. Mason laughed softly. I was hoping you would say that. Following the narrow road through the forest as sunlight filtered between the tall pines. After several miles, I reached a scenic overlook above the valley and instinctively pulled over. The mountains stretched endlessly beneath the clear morning sky. I reached into my wallet, looked at the card again, and realized I did not want this meeting to become another memory left unfinished. Without giving myself time to overthink the decision, I opened my phone and typed a single message. I made it safely. Thank you for staying. I pressed send before I could change my mind. Less than a minute later, my phone vibrated. Mason had already replied. I was hoping you would be the first one to write. I smiled so naturally that I barely recognized the person reflected in the windshield. Somewhere between a forgotten memory, an unexpected storm, and one quiet night in a mountain cabin, I had finally stopped planning every possible future and allowed myself to look forward to one I could not have imagined. Nearly 1 year later, I found myself driving along the same mountain road once again. But this time there were no site plans on the passenger seat, no inspection schedule waiting in my backpack, and no carefully organized checklist telling me exactly how the day should unfold. Instead, there was only a small overnight bag, a paper cup of hazelnut coffee that made me smile every time I looked at it, and a quiet excitement I had stopped trying to explain. Autumn had transformed the forest completely. Golden leaves shimmered beneath warm afternoon sunlight. The lake reflected a brilliant blue sky, and the mountain that had once trapped me inside a storm now welcomed me with peaceful silence. As I turned the final corner, the familiar cabin came into view. Mason was already waiting on the porch, leaning casually against the wooden railing with 2 steaming mugs resting beside him. The moment he noticed my truck, his face brightened with the same calm smile that had first caught my attention in the general store. You made excellent time, he said as I climbed the porch steps. I accepted one of the mugs and laughed. I planned to drive carefully. He raised an eyebrow with playful amusement. Some habits never disappear. Not all of them should. We stood side by side looking across the lake, letting the comfortable silence speak for itself. Over the past year, that silence had become one of my favorite parts of knowing him. It had started with a single text message, then weekend coffee, long phone calls, quiet dinners, hiking trails, bookstore visits, and countless ordinary afternoons that somehow became unforgettable simply because we shared them together. There had never been one dramatic declaration that changed everything overnight. Instead, our relationship had grown through patience, trust, and hundreds of small choices to keep showing up for one another. We carried our coffee inside the cabin, and I immediately noticed something that made me stop. The old wooden chair beside the fireplace looked different. Mason noticed my expression and smiled. Go ahead, he said. I sat down carefully before realizing the worn cushion had been replaced with a new one, softer and far more comfortable than I remembered. You fixed it, I said in surprise. He nodded. Last year you mentioned it was the least comfortable chair you had ever sat in. I looked at him, genuinely speechless. You remembered that? He laughed quietly. You are not the only one who remembers small details. I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. The repaired chair was a simple gesture, yet it somehow meant more than any expensive gift ever could. It reminded me that real affection often lived inside the smallest acts of attention. Later that afternoon, we walked slowly along the lakeside trail, where colorful leaves drifted through the cool air and settled gently across the path. We stopped near the same overlook where the rain had once hidden everything beyond a few feet. Now the mountains stretched endlessly beneath clear skies. I looked toward Mason and realized how completely my understanding of certainty had changed. For years, I believed security came from controlling every possible outcome. Instead, I had found something far stronger by accepting the unexpected. One ordinary stop for coffee had led to an unforgettable night. One forgotten photograph had restored a memory I never knew I had lost. One storm had quietly redirected 2 lives that had crossed paths years before without either of us understanding why. Mason reached into his pocket and gently held up the faded business card he had given me that morning long ago. You still have yours? He asked with a smile. I pulled my own copy from my wallet. Its edges softened from months of carrying it everywhere. We both laughed at the coincidence before slipping the cards back into our pockets. As the afternoon sun settled behind the mountains and warm light reflected across the peaceful lake, I realized that the most meaningful journeys are rarely the ones we spend years planning. Sometimes they begin with a stranger who remembers your favorite coffee, a storm that refuses to let you leave, and the courage to say yes to a future that arrives without warning.